Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking Tessa and Beatrice for inviting me to speak here today. I feel like a little bit of an imposter, as unlike the rest of the panel, I'm not a museum curator or an academic. I am actually an architectural model maker by profession, and I've been working in this field for 30 years. I run a very, very small business indeed. It's just me by myself, and I create all sorts of miniature houses, from stately homes to terraced houses, and with all of them, I try and gain as much insight I can into the design and structure of the building. I feel that there's a great deal of crossover between these miniatures and the dolls' houses you've been hearing about. And this one I was very lucky to start my career with. It's a model of Highgrove, which was commissioned by a friend of the Prince of Wales as a birthday present for him back in 1997. So this was very early on in my career. At the time, I was actually working in the film industry as a scenic painter and model maker for a production designer called Jerry Judah. And we were doing all sorts of things, from making backgrounds to pop videos to designing models for advertisements and for the little breaks between TV programs. In this time, the model making and physical models were used a lot in television and film. Obviously, today it's a completely different story. With the advent of computer design and virtual reality, the physical model has really disappeared almost completely, with the exception of things like Wallace and Gromit from the television industry. When this began to happen back in the 90s and work was becoming more scarce, I decided to start my business in house portraiture. Basically what I do is a package. I begin by surveying the house, and this means literally crawling around with a tape measure, taking measurements of windows, doors, and even counting bricks for the least accessible places. I know that on average a brick is 7.5 centimeters high, including the mortar, and so if I know a house is 300 bricks, I can easily work out the height in meters. The survey then ends up with me producing an architectural drawing, and from that drawing, I produce the highly detailed model. With my models, I like to really concentrate on the finish, the painting effects, the weathering and texturing. This is, on the left is a house in Amsterdam, and on the right is a house round the corner in South Kensington. So these are quite appropriate commissions to show you. In doing this for the last 30 years, I've become fascinated with everybody else's fascination in the miniature. And it's led me to think very deeply about why people are so drawn to models and what makes them so interesting for the average person. One of the major reasons I think that models are so fascinating is about context. That when you look at a street of Victorian houses, you might admire the architectural detail, but I doubt that you would notice it in its minutiae and really sort of look at it more deeply. Something I learned in the film industry, and something that my old boss, Jerry Judah, said to me, was that model making was about deep looking, deep understanding about what you're seeing. And I feel that when you see a model of a building in isolation, whether it's in a picture frame or in a glass vitrine case, you begin to really appreciate the details in a way that you simply can't appreciate the details of the real house. Often I work with clients and they say to me, I don't think we've got a drain pipe on the front of the house. Are you sure there's one there? And they've actually never taken the time to stand in the street and really ogle their property. But, why would you? So when you see it in model form, it becomes really fascinating. And I always say that what's fascinating about this is that the smaller you make something, the harder people look at it and the more closely they seem to understand it. So with all this very detailed measurement and architectural drawing that I do to produce my models, I got a sort of name for myself in in creating very accurate representations of buildings. And quite early on, I was asked to recreate a model for a small museum in South London in the park at Cheam. And this is a model of Nonsuch Palace. And Nonsuch Palace was built by Henry VIII in 1538, and it was really to become the home of the boy king Edward VI. Unfortunately, there are no remains of the palace existing anymore. It went through several tranches of ownership until it ended up in the hands of Barbara Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine. In 1682, she actually lost the palace, apparently in a game of cards. And because of her debts, the entire building was gradually demolished and robbed out of all its materials. The work I did for Nonsuch Palace Museum led me to the attention of the Royal Collection Trust, and I was invited to make a series of models for them of Windsor Castle. This is the largest of the models I made, which is showing the castle layout in 1377. And for this, I worked with a historian, Dr. Stephen Brindle, who was an absolute expert in the history of the castle. And he took me on a tour that lasted, I think, 12 hours, where we walked around the whole building. But not only that, we got an access all areas pass. And we saw areas of the castle that were not open to the public, the Queen's private apartments, all sorts of little sort of vaults and dungeons, and even the inside of the main round tower, which was absolutely fascinating. So I've done all sorts of models in my time. This is a recreation of an entire street in central London, in Farringdon. This is Cloth Fair. And this was for a private collector who had lived in one of the houses on the street. And he said to me that he wanted to visualize the house as it looked in 1900, because after that date, about a third of the houses on the street were demolished. So it was a matter of looking at Victorian photographs, and oddly enough, there were a lot of Victorian photographs of this street in existence. And using just the photographs as reference, I managed to piece the entire street together. So going back to more work for the Royal Collection Trust, I was asked to restore some aspects of Queen Mary's Doll's House. And for me, this was a fascinating opportunity to get up close to an artifact that I'd admired all my life. The model is quite incredible, and I think what struck me most working in close proximity to it was the use of materials. The building itself is made of wood, obviously, but the interiors, the interior objects in the house are just incredible because they are so meticulously made that glasses are made of real glass, that wine bottles have real wine in them. There are books with readable text in, and I know that Catherine Jones will say a lot more about this later on in her talk. But it was just this fact of using real materials, which struck me as an amazing feat. For me, in my professional life, model making is all about artifice. It's going back to what I learned in the film industry, that when I was making something to look like glass, I would usually use plastic or perspex. A lot of models that I've made have been made of car body filler. It just depends. You use a material that is practical at the time and serves the purpose. And so working on Queen Mary's Doll's House, I had to step back with reverence and try and be a lot more accurate about the materials I was using. And it taught me a great deal. One of the major jobs I had to do was restore the broken glass in the doors of niches that surrounded the doll's house, in the doll's house room. These had been pressed by eager visitors who desperately wanted to open the doors, but they had little latches, so they were locked. But in pressing the doors again and again, eventually the glass cracked. So I actually managed to source from a photographic shop in Clerkenwell a tiny package of 1mm thick glass, which I don't think had moved from the shelf since 1954. And I think I might be the owner of the last package of 1mm thick glass in the UK. So if you need anywhere, you know where to come. Many of the glazing bars had been lost from these doors, partly because they were glued onto the surface of the glass with animal glue, which was water soluble. So when the doors had been cleaned in the past, some of the glazing bars had obviously fallen off. And with every niche that I opened up, I found in the corner there was a little respectful pile of abandoned glazing bars. So I was able to recycle a lot of them, but some of them had to be remade. And I did this using responsibly sourced mahogany to match the originals. I also got information from a paint expert about exactly the right type of paint to use. And on the left-hand side of this picture, you'll see I was hand-making some architectural features called guttae, which hang down from the frieze which surrounded the doll's house niches. I'd like to talk briefly about the case study, which was the title of this talk, because I feel that explaining about my work on Kinnaird Castle also helps to illustrate many of the important reasons why I find miniatures so fascinating. This is Kinnaird Castle as it stood in 1790, and it was this beautiful, beautiful Georgian symmetrical building. It's not how it appears today. Some say that it's been improved, others may disagree, but it is now a building in the Scottish baronial style, and it's home to the Duke of Fife. When I went there to meet him, he said to me that he wanted to have a model of what the house looked like in 1790. He was desperate to find out the layout of the property and the architectural design, and he confided in me that he didn't much like the style of it today. The house had been modernised in 1860 by David Bryce, who is a prolific architect from Edinburgh and had designed over 200 buildings in this very ornate style. In 1921, the castle was severely damaged by fire, and many of the towers and parapets and roof decoration was lost at that time. Before David Bryce and also the modernisation of 1790 took place, the house was basically a fortified tower house. And looking at the back of the building, you could see the number of outbuildings, stables, and chimneys they were. It was an absolute maze. And this was one of the reasons why the Duke of Fife asked me to make a model, because he really couldn't comprehend the layout as it was back then in 1790. So the house was designed by an architect called James Playfair as a sedate and symmetrical Georgian house. And James Playfair's design only lasted 60 years until David Bryce's modernisation. The journey of architectural rediscovery that I took in order to create my model took me first to Edinburgh and then to the Sir John Soane Museum. This painting by Lady Agnes Carnegie is probably the most vital piece of information that I had for the whole project. She was not a professional artist, but she was incredibly accomplished. And I found out by my research that the details that she painted here were extraordinarily accurate, even down to the chimney positions. Other engravings in the Duke's collection showed various anomalies which were confusing. Due to the landscaping around the castle, there's only one really good spot to take a view of the whole house. So most paintings and drawings of the castle were made from this spot you can see, this view, which is the same as the view of Lady Agnes Carnegie. The problem with all these etchings and engravings was that because these are done in the studio and the artist simply does a pencil drawing on site, many of the architectural details were mistranscribed. So the numbers of windows and the numbers of chimneys, which is probably not very important to the artist, but vital for me, were often confusing and misleading. The Duke did have an entire set of David Bryce's plans, which were amazingly detailed, but just to make them extra confusing, and for some reason that I've got to find out, I don't know the answer to this, all of these plans were actually drawn in reverse, in mirror image. I think this was to do with the copying technique for reproducing the plans, and I would really like to get to the bottom of why these were all done in mirror image, but it made life quite difficult in reading the plans and then orientating yourself in the building. On a walk around the castle, I was shown traces of the original render from James Playfair's design, one in the back of a garage, and one in the remains of the library that was destroyed by the fire of 1921. The great thing about the render in the library is that it showed the brick coursing, which was added as a decorative feature in bands. And this brickwork or blockwork was great because it gave me a sense of scale and also a grid work almost to reference the entire facade of the building. The final piece of information that I got from Kinnaird Castle was a drainage plan, which was drawn by Mr. Smith, and we know nothing about him, except that he was an incredibly accurate draftsman. And although he was interested in the drains, it was fascinating for me because he managed to give me every single window and door position on the ground floor, which was very helpful of him. After leaving Kinnaird Castle, I went to the National Library National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, and I actually managed to find James Playfair's notebook. He worked on Kinnaird from 1786 to 1791, and he worked in his practice in London. During that time, he became great friends with Sir John Soane, and when he died at the young age of 39 in 1794, Sir John Soane helped organise his affairs. He sorted his drawings into folios and then organised an auction with his widow. And then Sir John Soane very kindly bought a great number of these folios, which remain in the Sir John Soane Museum to this day. I contacted Frances Sands, the curator of drawings and books at the Soane Museum, and she very helpfully dug out the folders I needed, and I found that in them were hundreds of drawings of Kinnaird. These were so detailed that I think I found everything that I could possibly need. Some of the drawings even dimensioned, which was wonderful. Here was the detailing in the porte-cochere and also a typical window detail, which was great. One of the most incredible pieces of information I found was this drawing on the right, which shows a very unusual feature, and it is like nothing I've seen in Georgian architecture. It's a sort of drum-shaped stone detail on the top of a pilaster, and in Lady Agnes's watercolour, it's shown vaguely in the background, but from that I couldn't understand exactly what it was. Finding this drawing in the Soane Museum meant that I could reproduce it in exact detail. So after all this research, I managed to create a set of architectural drawings which are the template for me constructing the model. You might wonder why I go to such lengths on the drawing before even beginning to make the model, but one of the techniques I use is very modern laser cutting technique, where every side of every wall elevation can be drawn, and then that can be turned into a laser cutting file, meaning that I can very, very quickly cut out wood paneling for window openings and doorways, and then this is layered up with other materials such as plastic card or very thin sheets of wood to produce the architectural detail. So this was the model under construction, nearly finished. At this point it was being given a spray primer, and you can see the windows in the foreground are not yet in, but all of the details are virtually there. To recreate this very complex blockwork pattern, I decided to use dry transfers. So I painted the model first in the color of the render, and then have these transfers made which lie on top of the surface of the paint. In a way, it's a bit like if you've ever made an airfix kit, putting the decals of the Royal Air Force symbols on the surface once it's finished. So here is the model in its finished state, and the Duke specifically wanted me not to give it a lot of weathering and texturing, as I do with most of my models, but to make it look like it was freshly minted, like the day that James Playfair had finished construction. Here's the back elevation, and it shows the complexity of all those yards and stables. And in the foreground, you can see those curious drum-shaped architectural features that were not clear from Lady Agnes's painting. So putting the painting and the model together, I think, is a particularly interesting comparison. It really brings to mind the question of why miniatures fascinate so much, why a doll's house or a model can give you a unique insight into a building. With a painting, I think that the details can be a little hazy. And the problem that I had isolating the architectural detail in Lady Agnes's painting, it shows this, that really the painter is under no obligation to produce a totally accurate representation of the building. Dr. Stephen Brindle, who I went on Windsor Castle with, put this very well. He said, when you're making a model, there's nowhere to hide. You can't just indicate something vaguely. If you want something to feature on your model, it has to be there in full detail, with no exceptions. This has frequently tried my patience, and it is hard on the maker, because sometimes you can spend a day and a half making a drain pipe that is particularly awkward, that no one will ever look twice at, but someone will eventually say, shouldn't there be a drain pipe there? So it's got to be there. The great thing about this is that, unlike a painting, with a model, the viewer can choose the focal point to look at. I think that this is the amazing advantage of looking at models, and something which makes a model so fascinating. Heike mentioned it very early on in her talk, when she said that it gives you the opportunity to view the whole house in its entirety, but with the advantage of scale. When you come to an extremely complex building like Windsor Castle or Kinnaird Castle, you can't take the whole structure in one go. It's simply impossible to visualize. With a model, you have that advantage. You have the advantage of a bird's eye view, or you can crouch down and look through an opening or into an arcade or into a colonnade. You are the visitor in this miniature world. You can devise your own tour, and you can discover the building at your own pace. And I think that this feeling is a strangely comforting experience, and something that triggers back to childhood. It's a feeling of control. It's a feeling of comprehension. You are master of all you survey. Thank you. That is my talk.